Hi, sweetheart. It's getting to be Christmas, and I hope you're having a good time. I saw pictures of you on a pony and visiting Santa and putting ornaments on the tree. And now we're going to do 3 parts of Chapter 8, The Robin Who Showed the Way. Part 1. She looked at the key quite a long time. She turned it over and over and thought about it. As I have said before, she was not a child who had been trained to ask permission or consult her elders about things. All she thought about the key was that if it was the key to the closed garden and she could find out where the door was, she could perhaps open it and see what was inside the walls and what had happened to the old rose trees. It was because it had been shut up so long that she wanted to see it. It seemed as if it must be different from other places, and that something strange must have happened to it during 10 years. Besides that, if she liked it, she could go into it every day and shut the door behind her, and she could make up some play of her own and play it quite alone, because nobody would ever know where she was, but would think the door was still locked and the key buried in the earth. The thought of that pleased her very much. Living, as it were, all by herself in a house with 100 mysteriously closed rooms, and having nothing whatever to do to amuse herself, had set her inactive brain to working, and was actually awakening her imagination. There is no doubt that the fresh, strong, pure air from the moor had a great deal to do with it, just as it had given her an appetite, and fighting with the wind had stirred her blood. So the same things had stirred her mind. In India she had always been too hot and languid and weak to care much about anything, but in this place she was beginning to care, and to want to do new things. Already she felt less contrary, though she did not know why. She put the key in her pocket and walked up and down her walk. No one but herself ever seemed to come there, so she could walk slowly and look at the wall, or rather at the ivy growing on it. The ivy was the baffling thing. Howsoever carefully she looked, she could see nothing but thickly growing, glossy, dark green leaves. She was very much disappointed. Something of her contrariness came back to her as she paced the walk and looked over it at the treetops inside. It seemed so silly, she said to herself, to be near it and not be able to get in. She took the key in her pocket when she went back to the house, and she made up her mind that she would always carry it with her when she went out, so that if she ever should find the hidden garden door, she would be ready. Mrs. Medlock had allowed Martha to sleep all night at the cottage, but she was back at her work in the morning with cheeks redder than ever and in the best of spirits. "I got up at 4 o'clock," she said. It was getting pretty on the moor, with the birds getting up and the rabbits scampering about and the sun rising. I didn't walk all the way. A man gave me a ride in his cart, and I can tell you I did enjoy myself." She was full of stories and of the delights of her day out. Her mother had been glad to see her, and they had got the baking and washing all out of the way. She had even made each of the children a dough cake with a bit of brown sugar in it. I had 'em all piping hot when they came in from playing on the moor, and the cottage all smelt a nice, clean, hot bacon, and there was a good fire, and they just shouted for joy. Our Dickon, he said our cottage was good enough for a king to live in. In the evening they had all sat round the fire, and Martha and her mother had sewed patches on torn clothes and mended stockings, and Martha had told them about the little girl who had come from India and who had been waited on all her life by what Martha called blacks, until she didn't know how to put on her own stockings. They did like to hear about you, said Martha. They wanted to know all about the blacks and about the ship you came in. I couldn't tell them enough. Mary reflected a little. I'll tell you a great deal more before your next day out, she said, so that you will have more to talk about. I dare say they would like to hear about riding on elephants and camels, and about the officers going to hunt tigers. My word, cried delighted Martha, it would set 'em clean off their heads. Would thou really do that, miss? It would be the same as a wild beast show like we heard they had in York once. India is quite different from Yorkshire, Mary said slowly, as she thought the matter over. I never thought of that. Did Dickon and your mother like to hear you talk about me? Why, our Dickon's eyes nearly started out of his head, they got that round, answered Martha. But mother, she was put out about your seeming to be all by yourself like. She said, hasn't Mr. Craven got no governess for her, nor no nurse? And I said, no, he hasn't, though Mrs. Medlock says he will when he thinks of it, but she says he mayn't think of it for 2 or 3 years. I don't want a governess, said Mary sharply. But mother says you ought to be learning your book by this time, and you ought to have a woman to look after you, and she says, now, Martha, you just think how you'd feel yourself in a big place like that, wandering about all alone, and no mother. You do your best to cheer her up, and I said I would. Mary gave her a long, steady look. You do cheer me up, she said. I like to hear you talk. Presently Martha went out of the room and came back with something held in her hands under her apron. What does thou think, she said with a cheerful grin, I've brought thee a present. A present, exclaimed Mistress Mary. How could a cottage full of 14 hungry people give anyone a present? A man was driving across the moor peddling, Martha explained, and he stopped his cart at our door. He had pots and pans and odds and ends, but mother had no money to buy anything. Just as he was going away, our Elizabeth Ellen called out, Mother, he's got skipping ropes with red and blue handles. And mother, she calls out quite sudden, Here, stop, mister. How much are they? And he says 2pence. And mother, she began fumbling in her pocket, and she says to me, Martha, thou's brought me thy wages like a good lass, and I've got 4 places to put every penny, but I'm just going to take 2pence out of it to buy that child a skipping rope, and she bought one, and here it is. And now we'll go to part 2 of this chapter.